Hey, good morning, Carl. I hate to be the Debbie Downer, but here's what we saw and what we didn't. Now, those two reports ease some of the biggest concerns around the AI trade this year in terms of demand and monetization. Microsoft affirmed CapEx, Meta raised its, GitHub Copilot users up 4x, Meta's AI-powered ad tools gaining adoption. But have concerns really been put to bed? Not quite. Zoom out, and Microsoft's CapEx last quarter was actually its first quarter-over-quarter decline in years. A potential yellow flag, at least if you're betting on uninterrupted AI build-out, digestion, or recalibration. That's not totally off the table with this report. Meta, meanwhile, did raise its CapEx plans by as much as $7 billion, but that comes with a caveat, too. Goldman Sachs expects depreciation is set to spike to nearly 50% in 2026, and Meta's own CFO told investors that infrastructure build-out costs, they will rise, driven by supply chain uncertainty and potential tariff impact. Then there is this chart. The scale of Meta's spending is eye-popping when you put it into context. It is projected to spend a bigger share of its revenue on CapEx than even Microsoft, Google, or Amazon, the hyperscalers, all of which have massive public cloud businesses driving demand. Meta doesn't have that enterprise backstop. Its bet is largely on Llama, its open-source AI model family, which is, by the way, underperforming the benchmarks and facing growing open-source competition from fast-rising Chinese models like DeepSeek and Alibaba's Qwen. Carl put it well earlier in the show. How much spend is reasonable chase in the overall contest, and at what point is it undisciplined behavior? This chart calls Meta spend into question. For shareholders, though, this also means that there's less capital available to return to them. Meta's quarterly share buybacks were down 11% from last year, and it didn't do any in the fourth quarter. So whether the mega cap comeback is real, that remains to be seen. There's still questions. Amazon and Apple tonight that will help to either validate that thesis or walk back today's exuberance. There are also, of course, guys, we're well aware of them. We talk about them every day. Those macro and regulatory risks still looming, like changes to the AI diffusion rule that could make it harder for NVIDIA to sell GPUs abroad, and the many lawsuits and scrutiny building up both here and overseas.
I still go back to that big DeepSeek sell-off day, Deirdre, because, if you look at a chart of the Magnificent Seven, that's really where it started. Yes, Liberation Day didn't help, but, there was a bigger decline into that from DeepSeek than after the tariff announcements. And I just wonder if some of those sort of big psychological questions have been answered with any of these earnings. The competition from Chinese open source models like a DeepSeek, the return on investment for names like a Meta or an Alphabet, and whether it's worth all of that spending, given what we saw from DeepSeek. Those are just the two big ones. I'm sure there are more.
That is exactly right, Sarah. If you look at April, right, we had the so-called Liberation Day, but it's been extremely volatile. The moves haven't actually been that big. I do always go back to that DeepSeek moment, that huge Monday sell-off that raised all these questions about efficiency and the commoditization of large language models. That is still very, very much a factor. And I remember at the beginning of that, too, you probably do too, Sarah, there were questions around Meta. Meta was seen as benefiting, right, because this was an open source model that arrived on the scene, and the only really big company doing open source here was Meta. But actually what's happened since then, it's actually exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities and weakness in the Llama model and showed that it's not just DeepSeek, but it's Alibaba's Qwen. There's a new model from Xiaomi. There's just so much Chinese competition in open source, which is so much cheaper than what OpenAI and Anthropic and others are doing. This has absolutely changed the paradigm, and you're exactly right to point back to that moment.
Yeah, although Laura Martin said, she doesn't know how they're going to spend the money this year, and they don't always hit their target, even with the guidance. Dee, that's
great point. They are willing to walk it back sometimes.
But she's also been bearish on Meta for the last few years. I missed the whole rally.
Dee, thanks for helping us frame it. So important. Our Deirdre Bosa this morning.